The cold, unyielding pressure of a gun barrel pressed against my temple was the first thing I felt, a sharp contrast to the gentle afternoon breeze I had been enjoying just seconds before. "Drop the weapon, hands behind your head, or I will open fire," the voice screamed, a jagged edge of pure, unadulterated aggression cutting through the peaceful atmosphere of the park. I didn't have a weapon. My right hand was gripped firmly around the textured rubber handle of my collapsible white cane, the tool that served as my eyes for the last 20 years. But to Officer Miller, my blindness was apparently a tactical ruse, and the color of my skin was a death warrant. What shattered my soul more than the boots on my neck, however, was the familiar low-pitched chuckle coming from the sidelines, the unmistakable sound of my own brother-in-law, Marcus, telling his partner to make sure he doesn't resist, knowing full well that I couldn't even see the men who were about to ruin my life. For most people, the world is a canvas of light and color, but for me, Elias, it is a rich tapestry of sounds, scents, and textures. My home, a sprawling 1890s Victorian on the edge of the city, was my sanctuary. I knew every groan of the floorboards, the specific way the air cooled as I moved from the sun-drenched parlor to the high-ceilinged library, and the faint, sweet scent of cedar that lingered in the hallways. I had inherited this house along with a substantial trust fund from my grandfather, a man who had spent his life fighting for civil rights and wanted to ensure I would never be at the mercy of a world that often sees disability as a weakness. My life was quiet, structured, and, I believed, filled with love. My wife Sarah was the light I couldn't see but could always feel. We had been married for 8 years, and our mornings were a choreographed dance of comfort. I would wake to the sound of the antique clock ticking on the mantel and the smell of dark roast coffee brewing in the kitchen. Sarah would guide my hand to my mug, her touch always lingering a second longer than necessary, a silent reassurance. We spent our evenings on the wraparound porch, the creak of the wicker chairs providing a rhythmic backdrop to our conversations about her work at the gallery and my tactile woodcarving projects. The only shadow in our domestic bliss was Sarah's brother Marcus. Marcus was a decorated police sergeant with a swagger you could hear in the heavy, rhythmic thud of his duty boots, and a voice that always sounded like he was giving an order, even when he was asking for the salt. He had never liked me. To Marcus, I was an anomaly, a man who lived in a house he couldn't appreciate, and held on to a fortune he didn't earn. He visited often, usually under the guise of checking on his sister, but I could feel his eyes roaming the room, calculating the value of the oil paintings on the walls and the pristine condition of the original mahogany trim. "You know, Elias," Marcus would say, his voice thick with a forced camaraderie that never reached his tone, "this place is a lot of upkeep for a man in your position. A modern condo downtown, something with sensors and flat surfaces. That would be much more your speed, wouldn't it? You could sell this lot to the developers my precinct works with. They'd pay a king's ransom for this zip code." I would always smile, my fingers tracing the intricate carvings on the arm of my chair, carvings my grandfather had done himself. "This house is my history, Marcus. You don't sell your history just because you can't see the paint on the walls." Sarah would usually jump in then, her voice a soothing balm. "Leave him alone, Mark. We love it here. It's our home." But lately the tension had shifted from annoyance to something more predatory. Marcus had been complaining about his mounting debts, something about a failed real estate venture and a messy divorce he was trying to hide from the department. He started asking more specific questions about the trust fund, his tone leaning into a faux concern that made the hair on my arms stand up. He talked about protecting the family assets and how vulnerable I was in the current political climate. I ignored the prickle of unease, chalking it up to his usual arrogance. I trusted my family. I trusted the walls of my home. I believed that as long as I followed my routines and stayed within the echoes of my grandfather's legacy, I was safe. I didn't realize that the man who sat at my dinner table and drank my wine was already drafting the narrative that would turn my white cane into a firearm and my peaceful walk in the park into a high-stakes confrontation. The normalcy of my life was a fragile glass sculpture, and Marcus was already holding the hammer, waiting for the perfect moment to strike so he could sweep up the pieces and claim them for himself. That Tuesday started like any other. The air was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine from the garden, and the neighborhood was a cacophony of morning life. School buses hissing, dogs barking at the mailman, and the distant hum of the city waking up. I told Sarah I was going for my usual walk to the park, a 3-block journey I had memorized down to the last crack in the sidewalk. I grabbed my cane, felt the familiar weight of my wallet in my pocket, and stepped out into the sun, unaware that Marcus was parked 2 blocks away, watching me through the lens of a burner phone, ready to place the call that would change everything. The week leading up to that Tuesday had been punctuated by a series of small, discordant notes that I should have recognized as a prelude to a symphony of betrayal. It started with Sarah's voice. Usually, her laughter was like a clear bell, but lately it had become brittle, snapping shut whenever I entered a room. I began to notice the subtle metallic click of her locking her phone, a sound that used to be absent in our home of shared secrets. One evening, as I sat in my study, the floorboards groaned in a way that told me Marcus was back, standing in the kitchen with my wife. Their voices were low, a rhythmic murmur that stopped the moment my cane tapped against the doorframe. "Everything all right?" I had asked, my ears straining to catch the nuances of the silence that followed. "Just family business, Elias," Marcus had replied, his voice dripping with a newfound, oily condescension. "Just making sure Sarah is prepared for the future. You know how it is. Things change fast." "What things, Marcus?" I pressed, stepping into the room. "Oh, you know, health, property values, the way the world looks at people," he said, and I could hear the smirk in his tone. I felt Sarah's hand on my arm, but it wasn't the warm, reassuring grip I knew. It was trembling, her fingers digging into my skin as if she were trying to hold on to a ledge. The most chilling sign, however, came 2 nights before the park incident. I was looking for my brailled transcription of our property deed, something I like to review occasionally to keep the details of the trust fresh in my mind. I couldn't find it in its usual drawer. Instead, my fingers brushed against a stack of smooth, standard paper that didn't belong in my tactile files. I traced the top of the page. It was a legal document, the ink still smelling faintly of a laser printer. I couldn't read the words, but I could feel the weight of it. When I asked Sarah about it later, she snatched it from my hands so quickly I felt the wind of the movement. "It's just some tax forms, Elias. Don't be so paranoid," she'd snapped, her voice hitting a pitch of desperation I'd never heard before. That night, I lay awake, the silence of the house feeling heavy and predatory, like a beast holding its breath. Then came the walk. The sun was warm on my face as I navigated the familiar path to the park, my cane rhythmically tapping the pavement. Click, tap, slide. I was thinking about the jasmine, about the way the air felt unusually still. I reached the fountain at the center of the park, the splashing water a constant, comforting landmark. I sat on my usual bench, the wood smooth and cool under my palms. The peace was shattered by the scream of tires on gravel. 2 vehicles, by the sound of the engines. Doors slammed, heavy, violent sounds. "Police! Don't move! Put the weapon down!" The voice was a roar, raw and terrifying. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. I didn't think they were talking to me. I turned my head, trying to locate the source of the noise. "I said drop it! Now!" The sound of boots charging toward me, heavy, tactical boots. I stood up, my cane held out instinctively in front of me to signal my status. "I'm blind!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "I'm blind! I don't have a weapon!" Suddenly, a massive weight slammed into my chest, throwing me backward over the bench. My cane flew from my hand, clattering onto the pavement. I hit the ground hard, the breath driven from my lungs in a painful gasp. Before I could inhale, a knee was shoved into the small of my back, and my face was pressed into the dirt and dry grass. "He's resisting! He's reaching for it!"
Another voice yelled. This one was closer, more familiar. Marcus? I choked out, coughing on the dust. Marcus, help! Tell them! Stay down, Elias. Marcus's voice was right above me, but there was no help in it. It was cold, clinical. Officer Miller, he's got a concealed object in his waistband. I saw him reaching for a black metallic device. The world seemed to slow down, the sounds becoming distorted as if I were underwater. My pulse thundered in my ears, a deafening drumbeat of terror. I felt the cold, biting steel of handcuffs snapping around my wrists, the metal digging into my skin. I don't have anything, I screamed into the dirt. It's a cane! My cane is on the ground! Shut up, a new voice, Officer Miller, spat.
I felt the muzzle of a gun press against the back of my skull. The coldness of the steel was absolute, a finality that made my entire body go limp with shock. My stomach churned, a wave of nausea hitting me so hard I thought I would vomit. We got a call about a suspicious black male brandishing a firearm in the park. Matches your description perfectly. And what do we have here? I heard the sound of someone picking up my cane. Then, the sound of a snap. They had broken it. Looks like a modified tactical baton to me, Miller said, his voice thick with a terrifying, casual malice. Maybe even a disguised zip gun. You people are getting creative. He's dangerous, officer, Marcus said, and I could hear the grin in his voice now, a sharp, jagged sound of triumph. He's been threatening his wife. He's unstable. I told you he was a ticking time bomb. The betrayal hit me harder than the pavement. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a misunderstanding based on the color of my skin or my disability, though those were the tools they were using. This was a calculated execution of my character. Marcus hadn't just called the police. He had orchestrated a scene where my death would have been a justified outcome of a high-pressure stop. He wanted me gone, and he wanted it to look like it was my own fault. I lay there, my face in the dirt, the man I had called brother standing over me, while a stranger with a badge held a vacuum of death against my head. I felt the earth beneath me, the earth my grandfather had bought and paid for, and for the first time in my life, the darkness wasn't just in my eyes, it was everywhere. My hands were shaking so violently the handcuffs rattled, a rhythmic, metallic shivering that sounded like a warning bell I had ignored for far too long. Check his pockets, Miller ordered. Let's see what else our blind friend is hiding. As Miller's rough hands began to tear at my clothes, I realized with a sickening jolt what that document in the kitchen had been. It wasn't tax forms. It was a petition for emergency guardianship and a transfer of deed, likely citing my violent instability as the cause. They didn't just want my life, they wanted my legacy. And as I heard Marcus whisper to Miller, "Make sure the body cam malfunctions for a minute," I realized I was seconds away from becoming a statistic. "Make sure the body cam malfunctions for a minute," Marcus's voice hissed above me, a chillingly casual request that sounded like he was asking for a cup of coffee. I heard the distinct of a device being toggled. The air around me felt suddenly vacuum-sealed, as if the law had just exited the vicinity, leaving only 3 people and a victim in a patch of dirt. My face was still pressed into the grit, the scent of damp earth and motor oil from the nearby patrol car filling my nostrils. "Sarah?" I croaked, the name a desperate prayer. "Sarah, please, tell them who I am." A soft, muffled sob broke the silence from about 10 feet away. My heart stopped. She was there. She had been there the whole time, watching from the shade of the oaks while a police officer ground my face into the pavement. "Sarah, honey, don't look," Marcus said, his voice shifting into a terrifyingly gentle tone. "Go back to the car. I'll handle this. Elias is having one of his episodes. He's a danger to himself and you. Remember what we talked about? The safety of the estate? The threats he made?" "I never threatened anyone," I screamed, struggling against the cuffs. The metal bit deeper, slicing into the skin of my wrists. "Sarah, he's lying. He's trying to steal the house." "Shut him up," Miller growled. I felt a heavy boot slam into my ribs. The
The pain was an explosion of white light in my mind, a jagged bloom of agony that stole my breath. "He's reaching again," Miller shouted, though my hands were bolted behind my back. "I see a knife! He's got a blade in his sleeve!" "Wait!" Sarah's voice finally broke through, but it wasn't the voice of my wife. It was the voice of a stranger, hollow, rehearsed, and trembling with a guilt so thick I could almost taste it. "Marcus, you said we were just going to take him to the facility. You said the evaluation was the only way to get the signature. You didn't say you'd hurt him." The first twist hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just Marcus's plan. Sarah wasn't a bystander. She was a participant. She hadn't been kidnapped or coerced. She had negotiated the terms of my betrayal. "The plan changed when he resisted, Sarah," Marcus barked, his patience snapping. "Now get in the damn car. Do you want the debt collectors at your door? Do you want to lose the house because he's too principled to sell? He's blind, for God's sake. He doesn't even know what color the walls are, and you're crying over a few bruises?" I lay there, paralyzed by a new kind of cold. The moment of silence followed.
I waited for Sarah to scream, to run to me, to claw at Miller's face. Instead, I heard the retreating crunch of her designer heels on the gravel. I heard the car door open, then click shut. She had chosen the mahogany trim and the trust fund over the man who had loved her in the dark for nearly a decade. "Now," Marcus said, his footsteps heavy as he walked toward my head. I could feel his shadow blocking the sun. "Let's talk about that trust fund, Elias. You're going to sign the power of attorney forms we have in the car. If you do, Officer Miller here might find that he misinterpreted the situation. You'll go to a nice, quiet private clinic for a few months to recover from your mental breakdown. If you don't..." He leaned down, his breath smelling of stale peppermint and cigarettes. "If you don't, Miller is going to find that knife in your pocket. And since the body cam is off and you're a violent suspect who already attacked a sergeant, well, I think we both know how this ends for a black man in this park." "You're a cop," I whispered, my voice trembling with a cold, crystalline fury. "You swore an oath." "I swore an oath to protect my family," Marcus sneered. "And right now, Sarah is the only family I care about. You're just a bank account with a white cane." "Check his other pocket," Miller ordered. "He's got a bulge in his jacket." Miller's hand dove into my inner pocket, but he didn't find a weapon. He pulled out my iPhone. "Just a phone," he grunted. "Smash it," Marcus said. "I don't want any GPS logs of where he was or who he called." I heard the sound of the phone being thrown against a rock, the glass shattering with a sickening crunch. But they didn't know one thing. They didn't understand the technology I used to navigate the world. They thought a broken screen meant a dead device. "You think you've won," I said, my voice dropping an octave, becoming steady as the fear began to calcify into something harder, sharper. "You think because I can't see you, I'm helpless. But I've been listening, Marcus. I've heard everything." "Who's going to believe you?" Marcus laughed. "The word of a mentally unstable man against a decorated sergeant and his partner. We've already got the paperwork started. Sarah signed the affidavit this morning. She testified that you've been hallucinating, that you've been brandishing weapons at the shadows." The second twist. Sarah had already lied under oath. The trap wasn't being set. It had already sprung hours ago. "And here's the best part," Marcus continued, his voice dripping with malice. "The trust fund? There's a clause. If the beneficiary is deemed mentally incompetent, the spouse takes full control. Sarah's already moved the first 200,000 into a holding account I manage. We don't even need you alive for the rest, Elias. Dead works just as well as crazy. Maybe better. No messy trials." I felt the barrel of the gun press harder against my temple. This was the moment. The escalation had reached its peak. They weren't just stealing my house, they were planning a state-sanctioned execution.
Wait, I said, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. If you kill me now, you'll never find the offshore keys. My grandfather didn't put everything in the local bank. There's a safety deposit box in the Cayman branch. You need my biometric scan, my thumbprint and a voice passkey. If I'm dead, that money is locked forever. It was a lie, a desperate gamble, but I knew Marcus's greed was his greatest weakness. I heard him pause. I heard the rustle of his uniform as he looked at Miller. Is that true? Marcus asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. He's stalling, Miller growled. Maybe, Marcus muttered. But if there's more, we can't leave it on the table. Get him up. We're taking him to the secondary location. We'll get the passkey there. As they hauled me to my feet, my joints screaming in protest, I felt a strange sensation. The terror was still there, a dark tide in my stomach, but beneath it, something else was stirring. A memory of my grandfather's voice. Elias, they will try to use your darkness against you. Never forget that the dark is where you are strongest. You know how to move in it. They don't. As they dragged me toward the patrol car, my broken cane lying in the dirt behind me, I realized Marcus had made a fatal mistake. He had taken my phone, but he hadn't checked my watch. My Apple Watch, synced to my home server, was still active. And when I had fallen, I had triggered the emergency fall detection, which automatically started an audio upload to my lawyer's private cloud. The confrontation wasn't over. It was just moving into the shadows, my territory. I could feel the sweat on Marcus's hand as he gripped my arm, the slight tremor of a man who was beginning to realize he was in over his head. You're making a mistake, Marcus, I whispered, as they shoved me into the back of the hot, plastic-smelling car.
Shut up, Elias, he snapped, slamming the door. I leaned my head against the cold glass of the window. I'm not the one who's blind, I thought, and by the time the sun sets, you're going to wish you had never stepped onto my porch. The ride in the back of the patrol car was a blur of high-speed turns and the suffocating scent of cheap air freshener. But inside my mind, the chaos had crystallized into a singular, icy focus. The click happened somewhere between the second and third mile. The man who had been sobbing in the dirt was gone. In his place was the grandson of a man who had outsmarted Jim Crow-era land grabbers with nothing but a fountain pen and a sharp mind. You know, Marcus, I said, my voice cutting through the hum of the tires with a sudden, eerie stability. You really should have checked the settings on my home security system. It doesn't just record video, it monitors the vitals of everyone on the property. The moment your heart rate spiked when you pulled that gun, my lawyer, Mr. Sterling, received an automated high-stress alert. It was a bluff, mostly. The watch was recording, but the vitals alert was a seed of doubt I needed to plant. I heard the car swerve slightly. Marcus was rattled. Shut up, Elias, Marcus barked, but the bravado was thinner now. And Officer Miller, I continued, leaning forward as much as the cuffs would allow. Do you really think a sergeant who's willing to kill his own brother-in-law for a Victorian house is going to share that $9.2 million settlement with a beat cop? You're not his partner, you're his fall guy. When Internal Affairs finds your DNA on my broken cane, Marcus will say he tried to stop you. I said, shut it, Miller roared, but I heard him shift in his seat. The seed was germinating. They pulled into a secluded construction site, a skeleton of a luxury condo complex that Marcus's developers were likely building. They dragged me out, but I didn't stumble this time. I stood tall, my head tilted to catch the echoes of the space. It was large, empty, and perfect for what was coming. The passkey, Elias, Marcus demanded, pinning me against a concrete pillar. Give me the Cayman passkey, or Miller here gets clumsy with his service weapon. I let out a low, dry laugh. The passkey isn't a word, Marcus. It's a statement. And I'll only say it if Sarah is here to hear it. I want her to know exactly what she's trading my life for. Marcus growled and signaled. I heard the crunch of gravel as the second car approached. Sarah stepped out. I could hear her shallow, terrified breathing. Elias, just give him what he wants, she whimpered. We can still fix this.
Fix what, Sarah? The part where you lied to a judge? Or the part where you watched a racist cop put a gun to my head? I turned my sightless eyes toward where I heard her voice. Here is your passkey. Record this, Marcus. It has to be precise. Marcus held up a phone. I cleared my throat. The passkey is, "The coward dies 1,000 deaths, but the recorded truth lives forever." And by the way, Mr. Sterling, I hope you got all of that. The silence that followed was heavy and sudden. Then, from the darkness of the surrounding construction tiers, the floodlights roared to life. "State police, drop the weapons, hands in the air." The cacophony of sirens and shouting voices erupted like a thunderstorm. It turned out I didn't need a vitals alert. My lawyer, Mr. Sterling, had been tracking my watch's GPS from the moment the fall detection triggered. He hadn't just called the police, he had called the district attorney's special investigations unit. I felt the weight of Marcus's hand leave my shoulder as he was tackled to the ground. I heard the clatter of Miller's gun hitting the concrete, and most satisfyingly, I heard the sharp, metallic clink of handcuffs being placed on my wife. "Elias, Elias, please," Sarah screamed as they led her away. "I was scared. He made me do it." I didn't turn my head. "The only thing you were scared of, Sarah, was being poor. Enjoy the court-appointed attorney." The retribution was swift and total. The recording from my watch was a masterclass in self-incrimination. It captured the racist slurs, the plan to fabricate evidence, the admission of the deed fraud, and the conspiracy to commit murder. Officer Miller took a plea deal, turning state's evidence against Marcus in exchange for 15 years. Marcus wasn't so lucky. For the civil rights violations, the attempted murder, and the corruption of his office, he was sentenced to consecutive life terms. Sarah was convicted of perjury and conspiracy. She's currently serving 10 years in a state penitentiary, her dream house replaced by a 6x9 cell. The lawsuit followed shortly after. Between the city's liability for Miller and Marcus's actions and the seizure of the assets the developers had attempted to launder, the settlement was finalized at $9.2 million. But the money was never the point.
6 months later, I sat on my wraparound porch. The air was cool, smelling of the jasmine that had finally bloomed in fall. The Victorian house was quiet, but it no longer felt heavy. The floorboards groaned, but now they sounded like old friends, welcoming me home. I had a new cane, a custom-made carbon fiber model with a grip carved from the same mahogany as my library. I was no longer the vulnerable man Marcus thought he could prey upon. I was a man who had navigated the darkest night of his life and emerged into a light that didn't require eyes to see. I sipped my coffee, listening to the neighborhood wake up. A new family had moved in next door. I could hear the rhythmic thwack of a ball being kicked and the joyful shouts of children. I felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost tactile. My grandfather used to say that justice is like a well-carved piece of wood. It takes time, it takes pressure, and you have to feel the grain to know where to cut. I had felt the grain of Marcus's greed and Sarah's betrayal, and I had cut deep. As the sun warmed my skin, I whispered the final thought that had stayed with me through the trials and the depositions. It was the truth that had saved me. They thought they could bury me because I lived in the dark, I said to the morning breeze. They forgot that the dark is where the roots grow strongest.